Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture on persuasion. So we previously saw attitudes, where attitudes come from, what they are, the affective components, the behavioral components, and the cognitive components of attitudes. Now we're going to switch gears and then talk about how we can change attitudes, either our own attitudes or other people's attitudes, and that's the concept of persuasion. Most of our lives, we kind of strive to persuade someone of something else, or we want to persuade them of an idea that we share or a value that we share. So we're going to talk about persuasion. Now, there are two main approaches to persuasion. First, we're going to talk about the dual process approach to persuasion. And then we're going to talk about the Yale persuasion model. And so the first approach is, well, first of all, there's no simple way of persuading people. You've all experienced that. Either you're trying to persuade someone or you being persuaded. So persuasion is a very delicate and very kind of, subtle kind of process. And so there's a lot of stuff going on at the same time. And so instead of thinking of persuasion as, just one size fits all, or there's one technique, or there's a few techniques, we kind of think about it in terms of there's two routes to the persuasion of someone, or two routes to the persuasion. The main model that we use to kind of investigate these two routes is the elaboration likelihood model, so ELM model. And basically this ELM model, the elaboration likelihood model, suggests that the two routes are, first of all, the central route. So you can imagine, like direct kind of route, and then there's a peripheral route. And so that's more of the indirect route. And so through these two different routes in different contexts, different situations, different people, different messages, and so on, there's to the combination of different things, one route will work better or will have more influence than another route. And so the central route is basically you get someone to think carefully, deliberately about the content of the message. And so in this route, or when you're using the central route, the person is thinking about it, is deliberately kind of using their cognitive resources to think or to deliberate about the message. They attend to the logic, they attend to the rationale, they attend to the strength of the argument, and a bunch of stuff about the message. So you could say that they've got their head screwed on and they're using it to process the information. Now, the peripheral route is kind of the opposite. Their head is not screwed on, and either they're distracted, either they're unmotivated, either they just don't care, and people in this situation will basically attend to the peripheral aspects. That means the situational aspects, or the non-important fluff about the message. This is where ad agencies and marketing a lot of marketing is based on this peripheral route, because they're trying to engage you in, ways of processing the message very easily. And so to process the features through the peripheral route, you're using color, you're using the length of the message, you're using the flashiness of stuff, you're using the expertise, the attractiveness of the person talking, to kind of evaluate and to kind of make a judgment and to kind of, create an attitude about the message or the message. And so what route do we take when we're kind of, in front of a message? Well, it will depend on two main factors. So these two main factors are, first, our motivation. So if I want to learn about the topic, that's one thing. If I'm not motivated or I'm not interested in the topic, so motivation and interest is one key factor that will kind of make me decide to use either the central processing or the peripheral processing. And then the second is my ability, that is my knowledge, the extent to which I have knowledge about the content, or I'm invested in the content. And so if I know something about the topic, and I'm motivated, I'm much more likely to use the central route. If I'm uninterested and I don't know anything about the topic, then I'll likely use the peripheral route. And so we can use different contexts, and we can kind of come to a matrix of understanding what what people use in different circumstances. And so when your motivation is personally relevant, when you're knowledgeable in the domain, you're going to use the central route. And in that case, you're going to mainly evaluate the quality of the argument. So you'll pay attention to the rationale. You'll actually, like I said, have your head screwed on. If the information is not personally relevant, if you're not interested in it, if you're distracted, if you're doing something else and you have to process something on the side and you're distracted or fatigued, or if the information is incomplete or hard to comprehend, so you're not quite exactly sure what the person is talking about, and you'll revert to the peripheral route. So this is you'll pay attention to the attractiveness of the person, you'll judge the credibility of the person, you'll judge the credibility and the resourcefulness of the person talking, and you'll use this kind of like the fluff around the message to make your evaluation of the attitude or of the message. And so our motivation, ability, and the central route to persuasion. So for persuasion, we want to use mainly the central route for persuasive and for long-term change. But if we want short-term change, or if we want short-term convincing, then we'll mainly use the peripheral routes. And so the long-lasting changes will mainly come from re-evaluating your thought, re-evaluating your cognitions, to have this longer-term change. And so, for example, if you want to try to persuade your friend to go to an intellectual or a foreign language film, let's say you're a big, huge film buff or movie buff, and your friend isn't a movie buff or isn't a foreign film buff, well, you'll likely want to either... if you're a movie buff and you're trying to convince your friend to go to this foreign movie, kind of intellectual, kind of smarty pants, kind of, I guess you could say, some people would say boring movie. If your friend is also a movie buff, then you'll talk to them about the amazing screenplay, about how the actors are just so, great and fantastic, and, it's just so intellectual and makes me think about all these things, blah, blah, blah. Now, if your friend is not a movie buff, then you'll likely tell them, or you try to persuade them to come to a movie with you because of, the flashiness of the stuff, the great visual effects, or, whatever, all the sex scenes that are in it. Anything that is not necessarily content driven, but more like, kind of attractive and flashiness. So you'll use different routes or different kind of convincing arguments to convince different types of friends, I guess you could say. Another way of looking at this, I found this on about kind of like, good description of the central route and the peripheral route. So, the central route, it will be audience that are focusing on the substance of the message. They'll influence it'll be influenced by individuals' interest and motivation about the subject. The change or the attitude formation will be longer versus the peripheral route. It's more audience. The audience will be, focusing on the peripheral stuff, the visual aspects, the superficial kind of stuff of the aspects of the message. They'll be influenced very quickly about either negative cues, positive cues. Individual biases will influence the way they interpret the message. The attitude change will be very short-lived because it's a very kind of like mood-induced kind of short-lived effect. And the change will not last. And so depending on what you want to do, depending on how you want to persuade someone or you want to deliver the message, those are the two different types of processing routes that you can use. So the elements of persuasion, another model that we use or that is used to look at persuasion is the Yale School approach to persuasion, which looks at the three components, I guess, of a persuasive message. They'll look at the who, they'll look at the what, and then they'll look at the whom. And so if you look at the who is listening to, who is the source? Where is the message coming from? And one of the first characteristics that we're going to look at is attractiveness of the person talking. We have all heard it before. First impressions are very important because we don't have any information about the person, or we have very little information about the person that we're meeting or the person that we're going to talk to. And so one of the first things that we'll evaluate is is their attractiveness, their physical attributes, and that will kind of set in motion a series of downstream evaluations about our evaluation of stuff. And so first, what we'll do is we'll look at the source of the message, and we'll say, is the person talking attractive or not attractive? Maybe that's one reason why most news anchors are relatively attractive. They're not super attractive, but they're not they're unattractive. I guess they're kind of they're relatively in the normal attractiveness rating. We'll also look at the credibility or the perceived credibility of the source, and then we'll also evaluate the certainty with which the person is delivering the message. And so first, like I mentioned, attractiveness will definitely have an impact on the spokesperson, our evaluation of the spokesperson delivering the message. And obviously, the more attractive or attractiveness leads to more persuasion in a sense that regardless of the topic and regardless of the content of the topic, if the topic is delivered by a relatively attractive person, it's just simply more attractive. One of the reasons is because attractiveness is automatically linked, or attractiveness is generally linked to good. And so if this good person is talking about this, then this topic must also be good. So by extension, we're kind of, doing this heuristic with this kind of mental hack, or not this mental hack, but this mental shortcut that if this attractive person is talking about this message, then that message must be good. If the opposite is, if an ugly person or if an unattractive person is talking about something, then we're going to associate the content of that message with the unattractiveness. And therefore we'll say unattractive means bad, and bad means, well, the message therefore is bad. And so be careful about presenting yourself, appropriately and professionally. Basically, attractiveness is really, professionally and kind of proper when you are delivering messages to people. And so attractiveness, like I mentioned, is judged more favorably. They produce, I guess, they elicit more favorable feelings, positive feelings, and then this favorability and these positive feelings are then attached to the message, and then therefore we extrapolate or we interpret the message more favorably because of the attractiveness of the source. The second component of the source of the source of the message is the credibility. So this is the perceived credibility, obviously, because it's very difficult to objectively always evaluate the credibility of every message. And so if the person speaking is seen as knowledgeable, trustworthy, confident, and credible, then the message will be received more positively, and the message will be more credible. And so non-credible sources, however, can have what we call a sleeper effect. And so the sleeper effect is the effect that occurs then when a persuasive message from an unreliable source is seen to exert relatively small influence at the beginning, but then it kind of creeps in. And so fake news, for example, is one example. So you hear something the first time and you say that you dismiss it. And you say, obviously, that's uncredible or non-credible a source. But then either you hear it somewhere else or you hear it from somewhere else. And then this little kind of sleeper effect kind of starts creeping into your thought and saying, well, maybe you start reevaluating almost the credibility of the source. And I think that's one of the contributions of, fake news, or kind of like, how people come to think about things that are, seemingly quote unquote ridiculous. One great example of this credibility effect that had a huge impact is Martin Luther King Jr. And so one of the reasons he had such a great impact in the civil rights movement in the States is because of his credibility, his knowledge, his passion, and the fact that, he led the kind of the movement. And so the fact that he was knowledgeable, passionate, and very, he was a good speaker, charismatic. He was relatively attractive too, right? You can combine all of these things. And then he became the leader, and therefore you say, well, if the leader is telling me this, he has a credibility he has a credibility that supports the message. The last component, or one of the last components of the source that we'll evaluate, is the certainty. And basically, this is, if you're unsure about something, just make sure that you look confident. And so, fake it till you make it, in the sense that, obviously you have to prepare to a certain extent, but, the fact that you're delivering a message, you're talking about something in a confident way, that will have actually a big impact on the way that the message is received. And so when in doubt, just speak confidently, speak with, not authority, but speak with confidence, and you'll be surprised by how much people will receive the message positively. Now, the other component, we talked about the who, that is, where is the message coming from? The second component of the Yale School persuasion model is the what, the content of the message. So we'll talk about the characteristics of the content or of the message itself. And that's where we're going to look at the quality of the evidence. So this will be the central route, sort of the quality of the rationale, the quality of information. And we'll also talk about the explicitness of the conclusion. So if something is very clear, the action potential is clear. I mean, so what to do after the rationale has been given. So if you want all of your garbage to be picked up 3 times a week, vote for me. So the 3 times a week is because there's too much garbage in the city. We have to pick up the garbage a lot faster, and I propose picking the garbage up 3 times a week as opposed to once a week. And so that's the quality of the message. And then the explicitness of the conclusion is, if you want that to happen, vote for me. So that's sort of an if-then, and you'll see that in politics, you'll see that in all sorts of contexts. So the message quality is high quality messages are obviously more persuasive in general, and they have a stronger motivation, especially for people, that have a strong motivation to hear the message, or also have the ability to hear the message. So if you're speaking to someone, or if you're speaking to a crowd of people that are motivated to hear about the content, the nuances, then you focus on the quality message. Now, if you're talking to people who are distracted, uninterested, then you don't waste your time on the quality message, because you know that it'll be kind of lost in the wind. So attitude change will come if the conclusions are explicit in the message. Just as my example with if you want your garbage to be picked up 3 times a week, vote for me. The other component of the message itself, and this is how you frame the message, this is how you describe the message, this is the words and all this stuff that you use to kind of, sell what you're trying to sell, the idea that you're trying to sell, is the vividness. And so the more vivid the examples, the more colorful, the more interesting, the more memorable the examples or the metaphor, the more effective the message. And one aspect that a lot of campaigns use, especially like donation campaigns or philanthropic campaigns, or even like anecdotes and even like stories, news stories. If they want to give a good message, they'll try to identify a specific victim or a specific anecdote or a very specific personal story. And so by narrowing the person's story, by narrowing on a person's story, it makes the story very vivid. You're not talking about general people. You're talking about Jenny's plight with child leukemia or whatever. And you'll see that, in a bunch of things. You very likely, if you used to watch TV, World Vision was always on the TV, or commercials for World Vision, and they're fantastic at identifying really cute, poor child, and they're saying, if you want to save this child, please give to World Vision, right? And so that's a very, very good and very specific example of bringing up a vivid information. This is this person in this village, and this is what they don't have. So it's very specific, very vivid, and it's also very individual. If you want to help this person, if you want to help this child, send us $30 to feed them for a month, type of deal, And even War Amps, War Amps, Canadian group that do fantastic fantastic work, and they use, pictures of, individuals, especially children that have prosthetics or whatever that need your help. And so it's a great way of kind of narrowing the information to a specific context and a very vivid use of your money. I guess they're kind of saying, this is how we're going to use your money with this specific example, which kind of helps you understand where it is and maybe convince you to give money or not. The other component, like you've very likely heard in many different political campaigns and many different kind of contexts, is fear. So fear messages contain vivid information. So you're compounding the vividness of stuff by adding this emotion, this illicit negative emotion, which is fear. And fear kind of makes us act. There are action tendencies related to fear, in the sense that it's very vivid information, and then it elicits this negative fear reaction, and then that we're kind of posed to do something about. We're not going to sit on our chair. We're not going to sit back and feel fear casually. We're going to normally do something about it. And these fear messages are generally most effective when they're combined with instruction on how to avoid negative outcomes. So, for example, back in the day during the Iraq War, George Bush was the president, and said, well, there are weapons of mass destruction. Iraq is going to wage war against us. And so that's the fear component. Now, if you want to avoid a war against Iraq, or if you want to avoid the weapons of mass destruction, raining down on us, then vote for me. So those are instructions on, again, how to avoid the outcomes. And you see that, and that's kind of a very vivid example of the use of fear and vividness. But there are examples of that a little bit everywhere. So, another example is, the establishment, more recent, Trump said the establishment is trying to silence us, so he made the established kind of, U.S. government as the bad person. And therefore, if you want to go against the establishment, if you want to go against the big brother type of deal, then you vote for me, for example, because I will fight for your rights type of deal. We don't have that strong of statements in Canadian politics, whether that's good or bad. I mean, it's definitely less interesting or less entertaining, but I think generally speaking, our Canadian politicians don't have that necessarily kind of as attack kind of statements. The other thing is that, in the States there are two political systems, whereas in Canada you'd be fighting against 3, sometimes even 4 political systems. So the enemy is kind of not exactly as clear, because you got 3 enemies almost at the time, or 2 at least enemy at the time. So it's kind of it's a little bit more difficult. Anyways, those are ways of using fear. Now, there are anti-smoking campaigns that have used fear and instructions to kind of, change people's attitudes towards smoking. And as you can see in the light blue bar, which is the lowest cigarettes smoked every day, that was the condition where they induced fear. So, the terrible pictures on the cigarettes, like all the prevalence of lung cancer and smokers, blah, blah, blah. But they also told you, well, this is the bad stuff that's going to happen, and here's how you can avoid it. So here's the most effective treatment systems, or here's the most effective treatments to reduce your smoking. And so the fear plus the instructions to do something about it was the best. And again, like I mentioned, fear is an action potential, or generally leads to an action tendency. And so if you can if you can capitalize on people's kind of willingness to do something about it, then you engage fear, or you elicit fear, and then you tell them, or you give them ways of actually doing something to relieve that fear, and then you can lead them, well, in this case, in the right path. But people have obviously kind of done the opposite, and they've led people in kind of in malicious ways, or they've tried to convince them differently. The last component of the message is a culture, or knowing your social context and knowing who you're talking to. And so obviously, you want to know who your audience is, and you want to tailor the message to your audience. So you want it to fit the norms, you want to fit the values, the outlook, even like the lingo and stuff like that. So populist politicians are perfect example of this. They know what their people want to know, so they just kind of rehash it. Now, the reason why they know what they know is because they pay attention to their audience. They pay attention to the populist kind of perspective. And so a lot of people, sit in their ivory tower and say, well, the best way to govern or the best way to manage a company is to do this, and this. And they forget to listen to, popular beliefs or popular kind of components. And so, basically it's kind of a no-brainer. You obviously, to have an impact, you have to, use the lingo and lose the language and kind of talk to the people in their language in the way that they will understand. And that's kind of using culture / social context / so on and so forth to get to that. The last component of the message or of the model is the whom. Therefore, like who are the people receiving the message? So we're going to look at the audience characteristics, and that's we talked about the source, the person delivering the message. We talked about the content of the message, and now we're saying, well, now the message is being delivered to whom, and who is hearing the message, who is seeing the message. And obviously, we're going to, well, not obviously, but the three main components that we're going to look at in the audience components, or in the audience, is the need for cognition, the mood, and the age, and there's a bunch of other kind of components. But today we're going to talk about the need for cognition, which is the effect, or not the effect, but the idea that some people are more driven to think about things more deeply than others. You could call them intellectuals, you can call them brainiacs, you can just call them like philosophers, you can call them whatever you can call them, but some people just have a natural tendencies to want to think about stuff, to consider things, to want to consider things. Whereas other people just say, well, just give me the answer, or just tell me which shoes to buy, or whatever. There's a very low need for cognition. And so this need for cognition is an individual characteristic that differs between individuals. And obviously, if I'm high in need for cognition, then obviously I will want to pay attention to the content. So my need for my need for cognition will induce me or encourage me to use the central route, because I want to hear the person out. I want to hear the arguments. Whereas if I'm low in need for cognition, it's not that I don't care about the message, it's that like I'm happy to be told what the answer is, or I'm happy to be told what the outcome is. I don't need to devote cognitive resources to consider things and to the way the pros and cons of everything. And so if I'm low in need for cognition, then I'll likely use the peripheral route to process messages. The other component is my mood when I'm listening to messages. And so mood will impact the way that we perceive the message, obviously. If I'm in a positive mood, I will perceive the message more positively, and therefore I will interpret the message more positively. And the other thing is that positive message will also work best with positive people or optimistic people. So the positivity, the message component, or the mood component of the message that matches the mood of the person will also have a combined effect. Finally, another component, it's not all of the components, but another component is age, the sheer age of people. Generally speaking, younger adults or younger people are a little bit more persuadable than older adults, probably because older adults have a lot more experience kind of anchoring their attitudes. There are a lot of things about my parents and my grandparents that I just can't change their attitude. I just can't change the way they think about things. That's not a bad thing. It's just that they spent so much longer thinking about it and kind of like rehearsing and kind of like reconsolidating the attitude versus my 4-year-old in class. One great example that I find quite striking is I had a chat with my son the other day about crushes. He's in grade 4, so obviously crushes are a kind of a thing. And I said, so who do you have a crush on someone? And he goes, I don't know, maybe. And then I said, does anyone else have a crush on you? And he goes, well, there's 2 girls and 1 boy. In the sense that And I thought that was, it was really cool because for them it's an option. It's a category for crushes. I mean, and it was just like kind of like that's just the way it is type of deal, you know. Now I think that would not have happened, 50, 100, whatever, many years ago. So for them, it's just like, that's just the way that they experience their life. And crushes for now are, well, either it could be boys and girls, or it could be, boys that are girls and girls that are boy, because, now in his class, actually, there's, a boy that's a girl. Anyways, all that to say that for him to consider gender fluidity is so much more easier because he's experiencing it and he's already kind of like living through it than, for example, my grandparents, right? To explain to them the gender fluidity would have been, I think, much more difficult for them because of their because of the way that they've developed their attitudes. They're very open-minded people, and obviously, they're not bad people. It's just, they've lived through life very differently than my son is living through his life. So we've talked about, like trying to persuade people and trying to kind of, get people to believe or to act in the way that we want to act. So we know full well through experience that we're not always persuaded by the ad on the TV. We're not always persuaded by, the 50% off this week, or we're not always persuaded by politicians saying, well, I'm the best, whatever. And so there is quite a bit of resistance persuasion. We're not always, we're not flip-flopping between stuff. And we do have, sort of a consistent kind of attitudes, or we have multiple consistent attitudes that we kind of, carry with us. And so, what are the things that why aren't we persuaded as much as we would think, or as much as we see in life, or that we talked about? One of the first things is the attentional biases and the resistance that we have toward new information, and so our pre-existing attitudes will resist attitude change because, generally speaking, the attitudes that we hold, we will attend to information that confirm this. We will interpret information in a way that fits with our attitudes, and will remember information that also fits with our attitudes or our values. And so this is a classic confirmation bias. So this is confirmation bias being used to kind of maintain our attitude and to dissuade us from being persuaded by something else. The other aspect is knowledge. Attitudes that are based on more knowledge are generally more resistant to change because you've got this huge bank of information that you've accumulated to build your attitude. So, through this confirmation bias and all this information that you remember in your database, and then you say, well, I've got all this information that tells me, that convinces me that my attitude is right. And therefore, that is anchoring your attitude. The amount of information that would be needed to counter that is almost double the information that you already have. And so if you know a lot about something, then you're much more convinced by it, and you'll need a lot more information about the counter arguments to unconvince you or to kind of like eradicate this knowledge. And so, for example, for many years, people thought that the Earth was flat, because they experienced it, they just saw it, like all of their knowledge was very experiential. And so it took a lot of counter arguments or counter knowledge to explain to people that actually the Earth was round. And it took years. It didn't happen in a snap. And obviously it took years, maybe even generations, to convince people and to kind of give the counter knowledge to then relearn, or to basically to relearn that the Earth is actually round. And there's barely a bunch of stuff happening right now, right? In our society, we assume things, we have knowledge about things, we have strong attitudes about certain theories, and we say, well, this theory is obviously correct because whatever we've thought about it, we've thought this way for many generations, therefore it must be correct, and we don't have counter knowledge to kind of to go against this the theory, right? And so who knows? In 100 years, 50 years, maybe we'll kind of reevaluate a bunch of different things. And I'd like to finish with, what happens when, or one of the resistance to persuasion is this idea of thought polarization hypothesis. So the hypothesis says that, the more extreme your thought is, or the more pushed, and the more you push your thought in one direction, the more entrenched you become in that attitude. So this is kind of one way of thinking about extremism, or kind of, highly identified kind of attitudes, or extremely kind of, anchored attitudes. So the more you think about stuff, or the attitude, or the knowledge, the more you go deep into the attitude, the more entrenched and the more extreme it'll become, which is, I guess, in some ways a bad thing, because if I'm so extreme that I can't even listen to the counter argument, I'm not going to even look at the attractive person telling me the information, I'm going to so kind of shut myself off from that, then obviously that's bad for society in general, because there's no diversity of information, there's no diversity of ideas, you can't kind of questioning things. And so this polarization hypothesis, I guess, is one thing to watch out for. And, that happens in some of us, when we think about something constantly and we hash and we ruminate. Rumination actually could be an example of, thought polarization, where we consistently convince ourselves that, we're terrible at things, and then we become extremely kind of anchored in our thought about how terrible we are. That's kind of one example of, anchoring a very negative, polarized thought. And so, yeah, it's something definitely to watch out for. And again, it's one way of kind of counteracting that is just not being so confirmatory, not using our confirmation bias so much, right? I mean, we want to be open. We want to realize when we are using our confirmation bias, and we want to kind of be open to, counter arguments or counter ideas, and, diversity of stuff. And so we looked at the ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, to investigate either the central route or the peripheral routes to persuasion. We looked at the Yale persuasion model, where we investigate, or we looked at, who the source, or, who is talking, what the message is, or the quality of the messages, or characteristics of the messages. And then we talked about the whom, who is receiving the message and who is the person interpreting the message. And, let's face it, persuasion is all around us. We persuade people persuade us, companies try to persuade us, and finally we try to persuade ourselves. So if you take a pause, and if you try to, try to introspect on where and how you try to persuade other people, and also and where and how you try to persuade yourself. With that, I bid you good luck, and we'll see you next time.